What can you do? What can't you do? What should you do? What shouldn't you do? It depends on whether we're talking about acting legally or acting ethically. Let's take a look at the difference. Hello everyone, welcome back to The Attic. My name's Mark Jago, I'm a philosophy professor in the UK. Today I want to have a think with you guys about the differences between the law on the one hand and morality, ethics on the other. So when we're talking about the ways in which we should or shouldn't act, are we talking about the ways that we can and can't do it legally, or are we talking about the ways that we should or shouldn't do things in order to act ethically? So before we get going, do me a favor, give this video a thumbs up. That helps me get this content out to more people. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and hit the bell icon to get notifications. So the law and ethics, they're not the same thing. For one thing, ethics isn't up to us, the right way to act. Most of the time, it's not up to us, whereas the law is whatever we make it. It's whatever the judges make of it. That said, in an ideal world, a lot of the time, we make the law so it tracks the main contours of ethical decision making. And for a lot of the big issues, the law does a reasonably good job of tracking what's ethical. So, for instance, murdering people, physically harming people, workplace discrimination, these kind of things are unethical and they're ruled out by the law. Okay, so these are cases in which we have created or adjusted the law to track these main contours of ethical decision making. Now, that's not to say that we want the law to capture all the tiny details of what's ethical and what's not ethical. So, for instance, you might think that in some cases, lying repeatedly to your best friends is unethical, but we don't really want that kind of stuff to be made illegal. That would be too much state interference in our everyday private lives. So we don't always want the law to track all the tiny little details of ethical decision making. There's also cases where what's ethical, what's unethical is kind of a grey matter, or it's a sliding scale and the law just kind of has to make a nice sharp cutoff. So we get examples of this around issues like the age for legal drinking. So we might think it would be unethical or irresponsible of society to let anyone of any age, kids, drink in a pub, so we have to put some sort of restrictions on there. Ethically speaking, you want those kind of decisions to go with how responsible that individual is. A lot of 17-year-olds are perfectly responsible around alcohol. A lot of 19-year-olds definitely aren't. I was definitely in the latter category. But look, you can't go around testing everyone for personal responsibility every time they walk through the door of a pub. So you just have to have some rules that say, right, we're going to have a cut-off at 18 and kind of bad luck to all the responsible 17-year-olds. Similarly with things like which side of the road are we going to drive on? Ethically speaking, there's no real difference between driving on the left and driving on the right. The main ethical principle is we have to drive in a responsible way, which means everyone driving on the same side. So we just have to kind of pick. And we, in the UK, say we drive on the left, on the continent they drive on the right. No big deal. So these are cases in which the law and what's ethical don't match up perfectly, and we kind of don't want them to. But let's put all of those to one side. I'm going to be more interested in the cases where we do want the law and what's ethical to match up, but they don't. And there's basically two main cases of that. It's cases where something is illegal, but it's perfectly ethical, and maybe there's an ethical need to do that thing. And on the other hand, we've got cases where acting a certain way would be unethical, but the law allows it. So in that first category of things that are illegal but ethical, in Nazi Germany in 1935, the Nuremberg laws, they prohibited marriage between German citizens and Jewish people. Obviously, there's nothing unethical there, but they were made illegal. These were bad laws. They didn't coincide in any way with what kinds of acts were ethical. We've also got modern examples of that on a kind of a smaller scale, I guess. So laws banning light drug use, cannabis use. There's nothing really unethical with that. In a lot of cases, cannabis use helps people medically, but it's been made illegal. Another example, it's currently illegal in the UK to go through the bins of a supermarket. So if a supermarket has got loads of food that it doesn't want and it chucks it into the bin, and a hungry homeless person goes to that bin and says, well, you didn't want this food, no one's going to eat it, I'm going to go in there and have some of it, that's illegal. But there's nothing unethical about that. And in the other category, the category of things that are legal but unethical, we've got historical examples like slavery. Slavery was legal both in the UK and in the US, but it was deeply unethical. Modern day examples fitting in that category, you might have something like corporate tax avoidance. So when you've got a loophole in the tax law, you've got ways of acting for a company that are technically legal due to that loophole, but they're deeply, deeply unethical. So when we have this kind of conflict between the law and what's ethically required, there can be cases when it's absolutely fine to break the law. In some cases, it might even be morally required of you to break the law. So one historical case of that was helping Jewish people during the Holocaust. So you've got this story of Oskar Schindler, the German industrialist who shielded lots of Jewish workers and helped them escape from Nazi authorities. He acted illegally, bribing SS officers not to capture his Jewish workers. We got examples of people who helped enslaved people in the US South escape from slavery, abolitionists and formerly enslaved people who helped others escape to the northern states and Canada using the Underground Railroad, people like Harriet Tubman. If you don't know much about her, she's got an absolutely fascinating story. There's a Barry Jenkins TV miniseries out at the moment, The Underground Railroad. In the current climate, 2021, we've got the Police, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Bill that has just been passed, which really clamps down on people's right to protest. It's got provisions like 10 years in jail for a person causing a public nuisance. And this worries a lot of people, because we're meant to have this right to protest. And in fact, the right to protest against unfair, unjust laws imposed by government, this is something that's accepted by both the left and the political right. So although we often think about protest as quite a left-wing thing, right-wing libertarian thinkers like the 17th century English philosopher John Locke defend our right to protest against an unjust government or unjust ruler. So Locke, in his political philosophy, it's all about the right to life, liberty and property. So this is why he's a really big figure on the libertarian right. For him, governments exist and can govern through the consent of the people, so that if they govern unjustly and they no longer have that consent, they lose their legitimacy in governing us. So in his Two Treatises of Government, Locke says, whenever the legislators endeavour to take away and destroy the property of the people or reduce them to slavery under arbitrary power, they put themselves into a state of war with the people, who are thereupon absolved from any further obedience. And, Locke says, in such cases, the people have a right to remove it, the government, by force. In all states and conditions, the true remedy of force without authority is to oppose force to it. In other words, civil disobedience. Now, we could have a really long discussion on civil disobedience, when it is morally justified, the right ways to do it. That's really going to be a discussion for another day. What I want to think about here is not so much that case where the law is prohibiting something, which ethically is fine, but rather the case where the law doesn't tell us what to do, it doesn't require us to do something, but where we might be required to do it by ethical principles. This seems to be something that in public discourse a lot of people get confused about. This idea that even though you don't have to do something legally, the law doesn't force you to do it, nevertheless you still might have a moral reason to do it. And in that sense, it's something that you should do. So one particular example I'm thinking about here is the COVID situation in the UK on the 19th of July. The UK government is going to be relaxing a lot of our rules and regulations, the legal framework surrounding what we can and can't do in response to COVID. So at the moment, wearing a mask in an inside public space is legally required. That's going to go on the 19th of July. And a lot of people have reacted to that by saying, well, look, there's no reason for me to do it then, is there? I'm not going to do it. If I'm not required to do it by the law, I've got no reason to do it. Why should I do it? And that's just a really bad bit of reasoning. Just because the law doesn't require you to do it, it doesn't mean that not doing that thing is the moral thing to do. There might be a moral and ethical reason for you to do it. So acting ethically is often about reducing harm to others. It's not just about that, but that is often a large part of acting ethically. And in the case of COVID and masks, there's a lot of evidence out there that wearing a mask in a public space reduces transmission and it so reduces harm to others, particularly to vulnerable people. So it's not just about keeping yourself safe, it's about reducing harm to others. And that's often the ethical way to act. So there's plenty of scientific research out there about this. At the moment, the British Medical Association is saying, basically, please wear a mask after the 19th of June, even though it's not going to be legally required for you to do so. So look, I don't want to get caught up on just one issue, whether it's right or wrong, but I'm definitely going to be continuing to wear my mask after the 19th of July, at least until a very large number of people get their full double vaccination, and then we just see how things go. What I do want to focus on is a little bit more on the way in which people have public discussions over these kind of issues, and I think it's often done very, very badly in the media, in social media. One of the things that is nearly always brought up is the idea of freedom. They portray masks or having to do this or having to do that as limiting our freedom. Once you wheel in freedom, that seems to just end the debate. Obviously, freedom's a good thing, so that's the end of the conversation. Everyone agrees that freedom is important. But framing these debates just in terms of freedom, it's a really bad way to go about things. And look, yeah, maybe people who bring this up, they're not entering the debate in good faith. Maybe not. But I'm just going to assume that they are. Okay, so why is framing everything in terms of freedom a bad way of doing it? Well, because literally any rule whatsoever is going to restrict someone's freedom to some extent. But that's not to say that all rules are bad. So, for instance, it seems pretty good to me that we have rules against just randomly beating up people for the fun of it. So that means in particular that I'm not free to go out into the street and wave my arms around however I want, and if somebody else happens to be, occupying the same space as them, they get hit. I shouldn't act like that. So that is, if you want to put it like this, a restriction on my freedom, but so what, right? I mean, the freedom to go and randomly beat people up, that's not the kind of freedom we really want to have. The freedom to harm other people just for the fun of it doesn't seem like a freedom worth having. So framing the debate like this in terms of freedom as a kind of conversation stopper is just a really bad way to go about it. The second reason why I don't think these debates in terms of freedom get us very far is, whose freedom? Whose freedom are we talking about? Even a cursory look at the details tells us that increasing one person's freedom is probably going to lead to a decrease in another person's freedom. So for vulnerable people who have to stay in isolation to stay away from any risk of catching COVID, they have more freedom when everybody else behaves in a responsible way. If everyone's acting in a really reckless way, they can't go out, they can't go to shops, they can't go out in public, they have less freedom. So, everyone taking off their masks and going into pubs and going into shops like that, that's decreasing other people's freedom. So whenever anyone is framing one of these debates in terms of, wearing a mask, I hate doing that, I want my freedom. Yeah, well, what about the other guy's freedom? Okay, is it freedom that you value? Or is it just your freedom? And if it turns out just to be your freedom that the person's valuing, it's not really about freedom at all. Really what they're saying is they just want to be able to do whatever they want, regardless of the consequences to anyone else. That's definitely not an ethical way of acting. Okay guys, so I wanted to make this video not to tell people what they should and shouldn't do. Everyone has to work that out for themselves. So what I'm trying to do with this channel is to get people to think philosophically, think through issues in a philosophical way. Because when we do that, and when we do that in a responsible way, not just trying to win our argument and get our own way, but we're trying to genuinely get to the truth of the matter, then the quality of public discourse goes up, we can help each other out better, and we can actually see improvements in public life. That ultimately is one of the main benefits of philosophy. Okay, so thank you for listening this far. If you have enjoyed this video, if you've got anything out of it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit that bell icon to get updates, and I will see you back here soon.